Do you sometimes have this feeling of carrying an inner world so rich, so intense, that it seems to overwhelm you without you having the keys to understand it? A chaos of strange dreams, troubling synchronicities, emotions so deep they can frighten you. You are not crazy. You are not broken. You are on the threshold of a discovery. This fear that your inner world might overwhelm you, this feeling of sailing alone in the midst of a storm, the great psychologist Carl Jung experienced it to his core. But instead of fleeing what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, he decided to plunge in. He transformed his crisis into the boldest exploration possible and documented this journey in a monumental work, which he then hid from the world for over 50 years. This work is the Red Book, the Liber Novus. It is not a theory, it is the logbook of his descent into the depths of the soul, an intimate conversation with the figures of his unconscious. Today, we are going to open this book together. We will trace his journey step by step to understand why what society takes for madness is in reality, for Jung, the sacred path towards self-discovery. Chapter 1. The Break with Freud and the Beginning of the Crisis. To understand the deep and secret nature of the Red Book, one must first plunge into the heart of the crisis that gave birth to it. This book is not a theoretical work, but the raw testimony of a man on the brink of an abyss. This man is Carl Gustav Jung, and this abyss opened under his feet at the precise moment of his break with Sigmund Freud. It was not a simple intellectual quarrel. It was a real psychic earthquake, a tearing apart that left him alone, adrift on an ocean of uncertainty. Freud was much more than a mentor to him. He was a father figure, an intellectual rampart against the chaos of the unconscious. And when this rampart collapsed, the chaos rushed in. This break was the catalyst, the crack through which Jung's inner universe, until then contained, was able to pour out. This is the starting point of everything. For when the masters we followed leave us orphaned, we are forced to find a new authority. And this source of truth, for Jung, could no longer be found outside. He had to turn inward, and it is this journey into the solitary depths of his own soul that would be recorded in the pages of the Red Book. The Jungian concept that illuminates this first stage is that of individuation. Simply put, individuation is the process by which a person becomes the individual they are destined to be, by integrating all parts of their personality, conscious and unconscious, to become a unified whole. The break with Freud was a necessary, albeit painful, step in this process. It was the refusal of Jung's soul to remain in the shadow of another, however brilliant he might be. It was a cry for his own truth, his own path. The most apt metaphor would be that of the young eagle which, to learn to fly, must leave the nest, even if the nest is safe, and the father eagle is the master of the skies. As long as he remains in the comfort of Freudian thought, he cannot spread his own wings, he cannot trust his own updrafts. The break is therefore this forced leap out of the nest. The fear is immense, the fall is dizzying, but it is the sole condition for his own wings, those of his own perception of the world and the soul, to finally unfold and carry him towards his own destiny. It was the end of security, but the beginning of authenticity. Following this separation, Jung did not find calm, but a storm. A profound inner upheaval that he would call his confrontation with the unconscious. Imagine, you have dedicated your life to studying the mind, to being the cartographer of others' psyches, and suddenly, your own inner map catches fire. The boundaries you thought were solid dissolve. It is a state that many of you may know, this feeling of radical disorientation where the world loses its colors and a strange and sometimes frightening dialogue begins within you. Jung began to be assailed by dreams of an unprecedented intensity, by waking visions that left him trembling. The ground of his own house seemed to open up, releasing mythological figures, desolate landscapes, and enigmatic symbols. These were not mere daydreams. It was the psyche itself manifesting to him in all its raw and primitive power. It was as if the dam of reason, carefully built over years, had just cracked, letting the primordial waters of the collective unconscious flood the landscape of his conscious life. This experience, terrifying for anyone, was even more so for a renowned psychiatrist who risked losing everything: his reputation, his credibility, and perhaps even his own mental health. This eruption of the unconscious illustrates a fundamental Jungian concept: the compensatory function of the psyche. For Jungian psychology, the conscious and the unconscious are in a relationship of constant dialogue. If our conscious life becomes too one-sided, too rational, too rigid, as Jung's life perhaps was, under the influence of Freud, who reduced many things solely to sexuality, the unconscious will produce images and dreams to compensate, to restore balance. It is a self-regulating mechanism of the soul. The most telling metaphor is that of a ship. If you load all the weight onto one side of the ship, the side of reason, ego, the external world, it will begin to list dangerously. The unconscious, to avoid shipwreck, will then create a counterweight on the other side. This counterweight consists of dreams, visions, irrational emotions. These are heavy, sometimes frightening messages that tell us, beware, you are listing too much. There is another part of you, another reality you are ignoring, and it demands your attention. Jung's visions were therefore not a sign of madness, but a desperate call from his whole being to regain balance and integrate the dimensions of the soul that his intellectual life had neglected. It is an invitation to look to the other side of the ship, into the dark and forgotten hold. Faced with this surge, the most natural reaction would have been to flee, to seek at all costs to silence these voices, to medicalize the experience, to neutralize it. But Jung made a decision that would define the rest of his life and the legacy of his thought. He chose not to flee. On the contrary, he voluntarily withdrew from public life. He resigned from his professorship, reduced his clinical practice, and turned away from social expectations to devote himself entirely to this inner cataclysm. He understood that what was happening to him was not a disease to be cured, but a territory to be explored. He saw himself not as a patient, but as an explorer. Instead of passively enduring these visions, he decided to go meet them. He transformed his life into a psychic laboratory where he was both the scientist and the subject of the experiment. This withdrawal was not an act of weakness, but an act of immense courage. It was the recognition that the most important journey of his life would not be made by climbing the social ladder, but by descending the stairs of his own cellar, his own unconscious. He chose to face the dragon rather than pretend it didn't exist. This approach is the very essence of what Jungian psychology calls engagement with the unconscious. It is not an intellectual and distant analysis, but total immersion. The most appropriate metaphor is that of the descent into the underworld, a theme found in all world mythologies. The hero must descend into the underworld, not to stay there, but to retrieve a treasure, knowledge, or a lost soul. Jung became this hero of his own inner mythology. He took a lantern and began to descend, step by step, into the darkness of his psyche. He understood that in this inner world, one cannot be a mere tourist. One must be an active participant, a dialogist. One cannot simply observe the shadows on the cave wall. One must turn around and face what is casting those shadows. This decision to actively engage, to take the language of the soul seriously, to consider his visions not as symptoms but as guides, is the foundation upon which the entire Red Book was built. It was the acceptance that to find the light, one first had to have the courage to traverse one's own darkness. Chapter 2. The Creation of the Red Book. Let us continue our descent. After Jung's decision to face his inner world, the question arose, how to navigate such a territory? How to map a world that has no geography? How to transcribe a conversation with ghosts? He needed a container, a sacred vessel to traverse this inner ocean. This vessel was a book, which he initially soberly named Liber Novus, the New Book. For nearly 16 years, with an almost monastic devotion, Jung applied himself to recording his experiences. This was not a personal diary where one notes the daily moods. It was a sacred act, an attempt to give body, a tangible form, to the visions that overwhelmed him and the voices that spoke to him. Each entry was the fruit of a ritual, a voluntary descent into the depths. It was not about remembering a dream upon waking, but about reopening the door to the unconscious and transcribing the dialogue live. There he engraved the words of the figures he met, the landscapes he crossed, the emotions that terrified or enlightened him. The Liber Novus was born of this compelling necessity not to let this incredibly rich and powerful psychic material return to silence. It had to be fixed, honored, treated with the utmost seriousness. What distinguishes this book from any other journal is that it is a total work of art. It is known today as the Red Book, because of the thick red leather binding in which Jung ultimately had it bound, as if to protect a treasure or contain a fire. Upon opening it, one does not discover a simple text. One enters a temple. Jung did not merely write, he painted, drew, calligraphed. He understood that the language of the soul, the language of the unconscious, is not just made of words. It is made of images, colors, symbols. Discursive reasoning was not enough to capture the complexity of what he was experiencing. The most accurate metaphor is that of an alchemist. The Red Book is the Athanor, the alchemical furnace in which Jung placed the raw material of his psyche, the prima materia of his visions and anxieties, to cook it, distill it, transform it. The goal was not to analyze it coldly, but to elevate it. By painting these strange figures and calligraphing their words, he gave them dignity. He recognized them as real parts of himself. It was an act of creation that was at the same time an act of healing and integration. Each page is a visual marvel, a testimony to this devotion. The text is traced in a medieval Gothic script, like that of ancient illuminated manuscripts. This choice is not insignificant. It immediately places Jung's experience not in the field of modern psychiatry, but in the long tradition of the spiritual and mystical quest. The pages are adorned with paintings of incredible richness, with vibrant colors, deep reds, dazzling golds, nocturnal blues. One sees gigantic serpents, fantastic cities, angelic or demonic figures, and above all, there are many mandalas. For Carl Jung, the mandala, this symbolic and structured circle, is one of the purest representations of the self, of the totality of the psyche. Amidst the chaos of his visions, drawing these complex mandalas was a way to find a center, to create order, to symbolize the union of opposites that were raging within him. Each mandala is like a snapshot of his soul at a given moment, a map of his inner world attempting to organize around a central unifying point. Looking at the Red Book means understanding that for Jung, beauty was not a mere ornament, but a path of access to the sacred. Ultimately, the Red Book is the logbook of his descent into the depths of his own psyche. It is the ultimate testimony to what he called a dialogue with the unconscious. This concept is at the heart of the work. Jung did not merely see images, he spoke to them. He asked questions of the figures that emerged from his visions and listened attentively to their answers, which he then scrupulously transcribed. The metaphor is that of an explorer who encounters the unknown tribes of a hidden continent and who, instead of considering them savages to be civilized, learns their language, customs, and wisdom. These figures were not, for him, simple hallucinations. They were the spokespersons of the archetypes, those universal structures of the collective unconscious. They were autonomous parts of his own psyche. Each page of the Red Book is therefore the reflection of a conversation, proof that one can enter into conscious relationship with the deepest forces of our being. This is not just Jung's book. It is the book of his conversations with his shadow, his anima, his inner guide. It is living proof that our inner world is not an empty space, but a populated cosmos, with which a dialogue is not only possible, but necessary for our completeness. Chapter 3. The Exploration of the Unconscious and Active Imagination. But what did these visions say? And above all, how did Jung learn to speak to them? The content of these explorations was often prophetic and terrifying. In the autumn of 1913, while traveling alone, he was suddenly seized by a frightful vision. He saw all of Europe, from the Alps to the North Sea, covered by an ocean of blood. He saw thousands of people drown, cities sink, and he heard an inner voice tell him, "Look closely. All this is quite real and will happen." For weeks, this vision haunted him. His first reaction was fear, the fear of going mad, that this vision was a sign of imminent psychosis. He thought, "It is my soul that is sick. It is my world that is collapsing." But in August 1914, when the First World War broke out, he understood. The vision was not just personal. It was a premonition. His soul, like an incredibly sensitive seismograph, had captured the shock waves of the collective catastrophe that was preparing itself in the depths of the European psyche. This experience was a fundamental revelation for him. He understood that the inner world and the outer world are not separated by an insurmountable wall. They are in resonance. The Jungian concept that illustrates this is the collective unconscious. For Jung, beneath our personal unconscious, made up of our repressed memories and experiences, there exists a much deeper layer, common to all humanity. A kind of shared ancestral memory, populated by archetypes, myths, and universal symbols. Jung's vision was therefore not just a prophecy about the world, but also a reflection of his own inner state, his self. The most accurate metaphor is that of a drop of water and the ocean. Your soul is like a drop of water. It is unique and individual, but it also contains the nature and chemical composition of the entire ocean. Thus, what happens in the ocean of humanity, the collective, is inevitably reflected in the drop of water, the individual, especially if this individual is sensitive and attentive. Jung understood that the violence, chaos, and destruction that were about to tear Europe apart also existed within him, as they exist within each of us. The boundary between the self and the world had just collapsed. Faced with such images, the question remains, what to do? Endure them? Analyze them? Jung invented a third way, a method that is perhaps his most valuable and practical contribution to the inner quest. He named it active imagination. It is not mere daydreaming. It is not letting one's mind wander. It is a meditation technique, a conscious and voluntary dialogue with the figures of the unconscious. The principle is no longer to be a passive spectator of the theater of one's soul, but to get on stage and become an actor. Concretely, Jung would sit in his office, close his eyes, and focus on a dream image or an intense emotion. He would let it grow, take shape, until a figure, an animal, or a landscape appeared. And at that precise moment, instead of observing it, he would engage in conversation. He asked questions. Who are you? What do you want from me? Why do you appear to me in this form? And he would listen with the same attention and respect as if he were speaking to a real person. Active imagination is an act of moral courage. It is refusing the easy position of being a victim of one's own moods and anxieties. It is taking responsibility for one's inner world. The simplest metaphor is that of a mysterious door in your own home. You know it's there. You sometimes hear noises behind it. Most people choose to ignore it, to put a piece of furniture in front of it, to act as if it doesn't exist. Active imagination is taking a deep breath, turning the handle, opening the door, and calmly saying, "Hello, I'd like to know who lives here." The goal is not to control what comes out, nor to judge it, but to welcome it and dialogue with it. Carl Jung understood that every figure from the unconscious, even the most terrifying, is a part of us that carries a message, wisdom, or energy that our conscious mind needs to be more complete. By dialoguing with them, he was no longer fighting his psyche. He was collaborating with it. It is this collaboration, this respectful dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious, that is at the heart of the entire process of healing and transformation in Jungian psychology. It is a call to stop fighting against ourselves and to start listening to ourselves. Chapter 4. The Confrontation with the Shadow. But when you open this door for the first time, the creature you most often encounter is not an angel of light or a wise guide. It is a dark figure, a disturbing presence, sometimes even monstrous. It is our own reflection in a distorting mirror. It is our twin from the darkness. In his exploration, one of the most important and most unsettling encounters Jung had was with what he named his shadow. It is one of the most powerful and essential concepts in all of Jungian psychology. The shadow is not evil in the diabolical sense. It is simply everything that we refuse to be. It is the sum of the aspects of our personality that we have repressed and denied, because they did not correspond to the ideal image we want to present to the world, our persona, our social mask. It is our primitive, instinctive part, our greed, our jealousy, our anger, our cowardice. But the shadow can also contain positive qualities that our upbringing or environment forced us to repress. A creativity deemed useless, a sensitivity deemed weak, an ambition deemed arrogant. The shadow is the psychic sack into which we have thrown, since childhood, everything that made us feel shame or fear within ourselves. Faced with this discovery of one's own shadow side, the usual reaction, dictated by our morality and our ego, is to fight it, to deny it, to destroy it. We want to be beings of light. We aspire to perfection, and this part of us fills us with horror. But Jung understood, at the risk of his mental health, that this approach was not only doomed to failure, but that it was dangerous. Trying to destroy your shadow is like trying to get rid of your own shadow in the sun. The more you struggle, the more it dances with you. Worse still, a shadow that is too violently repressed does not disappear. It accumulates in the cellars of our psyche, becomes more monstrous, more enraged, and eventually controls us from the unconscious. It then projects onto others. What we cannot stand in others is very often a part of our own shadow that we refuse to see. The path that Jung proposes is radically different. It is not a path of suppression, but of integration. You must have the courage to turn around, look your shadow in the eyes and say to it, "I see you. I know you are part of me. I will not let you take control, but I will no longer deny you. This integration of the shadow is an absolutely essential step to achieving what Jung calls completeness, to realizing one's individuation. For the shadow, while it contains dark aspects, is also an immense source of power and vitality. It is the receptacle of our instinctive energy, our raw creativity, our connection to the earth and the body. By cutting off ties with our shadow, we become civilized beings, certainly, but also flat, without depth, cut off from our roots and our life force. The most accurate metaphor is that of a kingdom. A king cannot wisely govern his kingdom by pretending that the vast, dark and wild forests on its borders do not exist. If he ignores them, fierce beasts will emerge to attack his villages. To be a complete king, a wise king, he must know his forests, map their dangers, respect their power, and even learn to use their resources. Integrating one's shadow is not letting the wild beasts invade the castle. It is learning to know them so that they no longer control us, and perhaps even learning to ride the dragon that slumbers there. Accepting one's own darkness is therefore, for Carl Jung, one of the greatest acts of moral and psychological courage a human being can accomplish. It is a difficult task, humbling for the ego, which prefers to see itself as noble and good. It requires radical honesty. Recognizing one's own capacity for hate, destruction, pettiness is a trial by fire for the soul. But it is only by integrating this dark part that one can become truly good, and not merely naive or harmless. This is the difference between a lamb that cannot do harm and a lion that could, but chooses not to. True moral strength is born from the knowledge of one's own capacity for evil and the conscious choice of light. This feeling you may have of having a dark part, an unavowable part, is not a sign that you are broken or evil. For Jungian psychology, it is a sign that you are a complete human being, and it is a call from your soul to stop hiding a part of yourself, to finally walk towards your totality. Chapter 5. The Encounter with the Divine. Once you have looked your own darkness in the face, once you have had the courage to accept your shadow, something extraordinary happens. The psychic space, which was just a small, constricted ego, expands to be able to contain not only the lowest, but also the highest. It is in this newly opened space that Jung had the most intense and overwhelming experience of his journey, an experience he recorded in his Red Book, and which he could not name otherwise than an encounter with God. In a striking vision, he felt a presence of absolute power invade his being. But this was not the benevolent and distant God of his Protestant childhood. It was a raw, overwhelming force, a psychic reality so intense that it threatened to disintegrate him. This is an absolutely crucial point for understanding Jung's spirituality. For him, the divine is not first and foremost a belief, but an experience, a lived experience. Jung's God is not an external entity living in the sky. It is an irresistible psychic force, an immanent presence deep within the human soul. It is the greatest power the psyche can encounter. For him, whether God exists outside of us is a question that cannot be answered, but that God exists within us, as the most powerful psychological experience there is a certainty. The most accurate metaphor would be that of gravity. You cannot see gravity, but you experience it every moment. It anchors you to the ground. It governs the movement of planets. You cannot deny it. For Jung, God is the name he gives to the soul's center of gravity, this organizing force of incredible power that one can encounter when one ventures far enough into one's own inner universe. It is an encounter that changes everything, because it shifts the center of your being. Your small ego is no longer the center of the world. It discovers that it gravitates around an inner sun far vaster and far more powerful than itself. This divine force that Jung experienced was deeply paradoxical. It was not just light, love, and creation. It was also darkness, fury, and destruction. It contained all the opposites. In his visions, this God was both a magnificent creator and a monstrous devourer. Jung understood that totality cannot be only good. To be total, it must include its opposite. The divine, to be truly divine, must encompass the totality of existence, day and night, life and death, meaning and absurdity. This is what the alchemists called the complexio oppositorum, the union of opposites. The metaphor would be that of nature itself. Nature is divine in its beauty, a sunrise, a flower blooming. But it is also divine in its cruelty, an exploding volcano, a predator killing. To want a God who is only good is to want a summer without winter, a birth without death. It is to refuse half of reality. Jung had the courage to look directly at this terrifying duality of the divine, understanding that true spirituality does not consist in choosing a side, but in learning to hold the tension between the two. This encounter with the inner God thus redefined for Jung the very meaning of spirituality. It is no longer about worshipping an external deity, following dogmas, or obeying priests. True spirituality, according to Jungian psychology, is the process of self-transformation. It is the path of individuation. It is this inner alchemical work that consists of integrating one's shadow, of dialoguing with one's unconscious, to give birth to a more complete and unified personality. And the ultimate goal of this path, the fruit of this encounter with the paradoxical divine, is the discovery of the self. The self, with a capital S, is the central concept of Jung's thought. It is the archetype of totality, the organizing center of the entire psyche, which integrates the conscious and the unconscious, shadow and light. The self is the inner God, that point within us which is both the center and the circumference of our being. To experience the self is to experience this paradoxical unity. It is to understand that you are not just your ego, but that you are also this entire inner universe. The encounter with God was therefore not the end of the journey, but the revelation of its true destination, the realization of the self. Chapter 6. The Integration of the Inner Feminine. After the overwhelming encounter with the force of the inner God, an energy often perceived as archetypally masculine, Jung's journey towards totality inevitably led him towards its opposite pole. For there is no union without the recognition of the world's two great principles. To become complete, the man of science, the logical thinker, had to meet and honor the feminine principle within him. He had to meet his soul. In Jungian psychology, this unconscious feminine part in a man has a name: the anima. In the pages of the Red Book, she appeared to him in the guise of a complex and fascinating figure, a blind young woman accompanied by a serpent, whom he named Salome. This encounter was not that of a man with an external woman, but that of Jung's conscious ego with the personification of his own soul, of his own inner life. And this soul was not a gentle, passive muse. She was a powerful force, an initiatrix who would teach him a wisdom that books and reason could not give him. The first lesson the anima teaches is that of surrender, of letting go. The masculine ego, especially that of an intellectual like Jung, is trained to analyze, control, understand, and dominate reality through thought. This is the principle of logos, the word, distinction, clarity, structure. But the anima is the guardian of the principle of eros, Eros is not logic, it is relation. It is not distinction, it is connection. It is not knowledge, it is feeling. The encounter with Salome forced Jung to abandon his posture of intellectual superiority. He could not analyze his soul. He had to learn to listen to it, to feel it, to let himself be guided by it. The most accurate metaphor is that of a man who wants to understand a river by staying on the bank, measuring its width and flow. The anima is the one who invites him to put down his instruments, to enter the water and let himself be carried by the current. It is an initiation into the wisdom of intuition, the truth of emotions, knowledge that comes not from the head, but from the heart. It is learning to trust what cannot be proven, but which is deeply felt. In the topography of the psyche, according to Carl Jung, the anima plays an essential role. It is the bridge, the mediator between the conscious world of the ego and the abysses of the collective unconscious. If the shadow is the guardian of the threshold, the first test to pass, the anima is the guide who takes your hand once the threshold is crossed. It is she who knows the secret paths of the inner world. Without her, the ego would be blind and lost in this strange and often frightening territory. It is she who translates the language of archetypes, who connects us to myths, to symbols, to the great memory of humanity. The metaphor would be that of a traveler in a foreign country. He might have a map, his intelligence, but he will never understand the deep culture of the place without a local interpreter who explains the customs, the unspoken things, the spirit of the people. The anima is this interpreter of the soul. This is why the development of a conscious relationship with one's anima is so crucial. She is the gateway to creativity, inspiration, and a wisdom that transcends our small personal life. Ultimately, the integration of the anima is a fundamental stage in the process of individuation for a man. It is the inner alchemical union, the sacred marriage of the king, the logos, the conscious, and the queen, the eros, the unconscious. A man who remains a prisoner of a purely masculine, purely logical, and non-emotional pole is a divided, unbalanced being. He can be powerful, but he will be dry, unconnected, soulless. By integrating his anima, he does not become less of a man. He becomes a more complete man. He gains access to compassion, the ability to create deep bonds, empathy, patience, receptivity. He balances the force of action with the wisdom of waiting. This feeling that many of you know, this need to go beyond simple rationality, this thirst for connection, meaning, intuition, this is the call of your own inner feminine pole. It is your soul inviting you to the dance of balance, so that your personality ceases to be a straight line and finally becomes a complete circle. Chapter 7. The Meeting with Philemon, the Inner Guide. If the anima, this feminine figure, opened the door of the heart, intuition, and relationship for Jung, another guide was to appear to teach him the language of spirit and meaning. After the guide of the soul came the guide of wisdom. One night, Jung dreamt of an old man. Later, while painting, he saw this man in his imagination. He had kingfisher wings and wore bull horns. Jung called him Philemon. This figure became the central character in his inner dialogues, his privileged interlocutor. Philemon was not a mere hallucination. For Jung, he was a distinct personality, a spiritual master, an inner guru who manifested to guide him through the chaos of his visions. While the anima initiated him into the world of emotions and relationships, Philemon offered him a higher perspective, a commentary on the events of his soul. He was the one who explained, who gave meaning, who brought the light of consciousness into the darkest corners of the psyche. Philemon is the personification of what Jungian psychology calls the wise old man archetype. It is a universal figure found in all myths and cultures. Merlin, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Gandalf, the wise man of the mountain. It is the representation of ancestral wisdom, a knowledge that transcends the experience of a single individual. Philemon was not merely an intelligent part of Jung. He was the embodiment of a higher wisdom that Jung, the man, could now access. He represented what Jung called thinking of the heart, a knowledge that is not the result of logical analysis, but of a direct perception of the soul's truth. The most accurate metaphor would be this: if your conscious mind is a book you have read, Philemon is the entire library of Alexandria, with all the lost and forgotten knowledge of humanity suddenly coming to life and beginning to speak to you. His presence taught Jung that we carry within us a source of wisdom far vaster than our little ego could ever imagine. Philemon's main teaching was radical and liberating. The importance of listening to and validating one's own inner truth, even and especially if it goes against all external conventions. Philemon taught Jung that the thoughts that came from his soul, these living thoughts, were more real and important than theories learned at university or the dogmas of society. He told him, treat the thoughts that come to you as if they were objects or beings in a room. Do not judge them. Do not say, I thought that, but rather ask them, who are you? You who are thinking within me. This is a complete reversal of perspective. The ego is no longer the creator of thought. It becomes the receptacle, the listener. This small voice within you, the one that sometimes whispers a truth that seems crazy or unacceptable to the outside world, the one you have learned to ignore or rationalize. Philemon would say that this is the most important voice you can listen to. It is the voice of your own inner guide. It is the voice of the self. Finally, Philemon revealed to Jung a profound nature of wisdom. True knowledge does not consist of learning something new, but of remembering what the soul has forgotten, but has known all along. This is the concept of anamnesis, the recollection of the soul's knowledge. Philemon represented this immemorial memory. He spoke to Jung as if the events of Jung's life were merely variations on eternal themes that the soul already knows. The most powerful metaphor is that of a palimpsest, that medieval parchment that was scraped clean to write over. Our life, our education, our culture have written thousands of lines on the parchment of our soul. The work with the inner guide, with Philemon, consists of gently scraping away all these layers of superficial writing to rediscover the original, sacred, and luminous text that has always been there. Wisdom is not an acquisition, but a rediscovery. It is an act of unforgetting. Philemon did not give Jung new information. He awakened within him a knowledge that was sleeping. He taught him to read the original text of his own soul. Chapter 8. The Death of the Ego and the Birth of the Self. We arrive at the heart of the furnace, the culminating point of Jung's alchemical journey. After confronting his shadow, dialoguing with his soul, the anima, and receiving the teaching of his guide, Philemon, all paths led him toward the final initiation, the most terrifying and the most liberating of all, the one the myths call the descent into the underworld, the dark night of the soul. This is the ordeal that Jungian psychology calls the death of the ego. To find true peace, to be born into his own truth, Jung had to accept death. Not a physical death, of course, but the symbolic death of the man he believed himself to be. The sacrifice of the identity to which he had clung so tightly. Carl Jung, the brilliant psychiatrist, the respected thinker, the man of science, the family man. All this construction, all this persona, had to be offered as a sacrifice on the altar of the soul. It is a moment of absolute anguish. For to the ego, this surrender is synonymous with nothingness. It is the fear of dissolving, of disappearing, of being nothing anymore. This abandonment of the old identity is the most difficult act on the spiritual path. It is accepting to let go of the only thing we thought we possessed, our self. It is the king who voluntarily accepts to lay down his crown, his scepter, and his mantle, to find himself naked, vulnerable, with no title to define him. For Jung, this meant abandoning his claim to know everything, to control everything through intellect. He had to accept not being the master in his own house, but merely an inhabitant of an inner cosmos far vaster than himself. This experience is described in the Red Book through images of dismemberment, sacrifice, and death. It is the crucifixion of the ego, which must die to its own arrogance and self-sufficiency so that a vaster reality can come into being. It is a necessary passage, for as long as the small I occupies the whole throne, the great self cannot be born. And this is precisely what happens. From this symbolic death, from the ashes of the sacrificed ego, a new presence is born, a new center. The true sun of the psychic system can finally rise. This is the discovery of the self, the ultimate concept in Jung's thought. The self is not the ego. The ego says, I. The self is the center and the totality of the personality, both conscious and unconscious. It is the true you, the authentic you that has been there from the beginning, but which was masked by the noise and fury of your ego. The clearest metaphor is that of the sun and the lamp. We spend our lives identifying with a small lamp, our ego. We take care of its bulb. We protect it from the wind, convinced that it is the sole source of light. The death of the ego is the moment when the sun, the self, rises on the horizon, and where we realize with astonishment that our small lamp was but a fragile and artificial glow. The true light, the true warmth, the true source of life was elsewhere, or rather, everywhere. The discovery of the self is this inner sunrise. This emerging self is the famous inner God that Jung had encountered. It is this entity which finally integrates all the opposites. It is the meeting point where the shadow and the light can coexist, where the masculine, logos, and the feminine, anima, can unite, where the conscious and the unconscious can dance together. The self is the archetype of wholeness, the goal of individuation. When the personality's center of gravity shifts from the ego to the self, life changes radically. One no longer seeks external validation. One finds it in this deep connection with one's own center. One is no longer tossed about by every mood or event, because one is anchored in something deeper, more stable. This feeling you may have of being limited by your own personality, this yearning for something greater within you. It is the call of the self inviting you to let the old version of yourself die so that the true one can finally be born. It is essential to understand that this process is not a destruction, but a radical transformation of perspective. The ego does not disappear. It is indispensable for living in the world, for working, for interacting with others. But it is dethroned. It is no longer the tyrant, the absolute king. It becomes the loyal servant, the prime minister of the self. The king thought he was the kingdom. The prime minister knows that he is at the service of the kingdom, and that the true sovereign is a much wiser and more silent presence. The ego learns to listen to the orders that come from the center, from the self, instead of listening only to its own fears and desires. This reorganization of the psyche is the greatest of liberations. It is the end of the inner war. It is the beginning of peace. Peace that does not come from the absence of conflict, but from the ability to contain all conflicts within itself, in the unity of the self. This is the great secret hidden in the heart of the Red Book. Chapter 9. Silence and the Voice of the Soul. Okay. The summit has been reached. The sacrifice of the ego has occurred, the self is born. And after this cosmic fireworks display, after this radical transformation, one might expect a life of grandiose visions and permanent illuminations. But this is not at all what happened for Jung. On the contrary, once the ego has accepted its rightful place, once peace has been made between the opposing forces of the psyche, the great spectacle stopped. The deafening visions, the dramatic dialogues with gods and demons, all this inner theater subsided. The cinema of the soul closed its doors. A great silence settled in. And it is in this silence, in this rediscovered calm, that Jung made a new discovery, perhaps the most intimate of all. He discovered that when the psyche stops shouting, the soul begins to whisper. In this quieted inner space, Jung discovered a new form of communication. The soul, that central and authentic presence, no longer expresses itself through violent images to force open the door of consciousness. Now that the door is open, it enters gently. It no longer speaks through enigmas, but through a presence, a gentle presence, a quiet certainty, an intimate knowledge that needs no proof. It is a shift from confrontation to conversation, from the spectacular to the intimate. If the previous stages were a heroic battle, this one is a love story. It is the beginning of a conscious and continuous relationship with the center of one's own being. The most fitting metaphor would be that of a raging sea that finally calms down. The monstrous waves, the visions, subside, and in the tranquility of the water turned mirror, one can finally see the clear reflection of the sky and hear the subtle sound of the wind. Jung then understood the soul's deepest quest. Unlike the ego, which seeks power, knowledge, control, recognition, the soul seeks only one thing: intimacy. It seeks relationship. It wants to be seen, heard, recognized by the conscious part of ourselves. It does not want to be an object of study, but a life partner. It does not seek to be mastered, but to be loved. This quest for intimacy is the fundamental desire of our deepest being, to be in authentic relationship with oneself, with others, and with the world. The metaphor here is that of a dialogue. The ego is a great talker. It loves monologues. The soul, it waits patiently for the ego to fall silent, so it can finally whisper. And its whispers are not orders or theories. They are invitations. Invitations to feel, to be present, to love, to simply be. It is the end of the quest for spiritual performance and the beginning of a simple and profound presence to oneself. This voice of the soul, however gentle it may be, is not always easy to hear, for it is the voice of our purest truth. And this truth often confronts us with our illusions, our lies, our comfort zones. The voice of the soul is the one that whispers to us, "This job no longer suits you. This relationship diminishes you. You have a gift you are not using." It is an often painful truth because it requires courage. It asks us to change, to leave secure but deadening situations. The most powerful metaphor is that of the compass. The voice of the soul is the inner compass. It always indicates, infallibly, our true north, our path of individuation. It doesn't care if the path is easy, flat, and well lit. It is only interested in the destination, our fulfillment. Listening to this voice means accepting to trust this inner compass, even if it guides us towards unknown and steep territories. This is the price of authenticity. This final stage of the inner journey therefore requires a new skill. It is no longer the strength of the hero battling dragons, but the patience of the gardener waiting for a seed to sprout. It is the art of attentive and delicate listening. This requires creating spaces of silence in our overloaded lives, turning away from the noise of the world to pay attention to the whispers of the soul. It is a listening that is not active expectation, but passive receptivity. It is being able to sit with oneself with no other goal than to be there, available for what might emerge from the silence. It is the end of doing and the beginning of being. This is the ultimate wisdom Jung drew from his long descent. After all the battles, the greatest treasure is found in stillness, and the greatest truth is found in a whisper. Chapter 10. The Legacy of the Red Book. We arrive at the end of this journey through the depths. Jung has weathered the storm, found his center, learned to listen to the silence, and in his hands he held the testament to this odyssey. A large book bound in red leather, the log book of his own soul. The most crucial question then arose for him. What to do with this object? Should he share it with the world, reveal the secret heart of his experience? Or should he protect it from the gaze of the uninitiated? Jung made the decision to keep it secret. He chose silence. Throughout his life, only a few close individuals were aware of the existence of the Red Book. It remained hidden, locked away in a chest, far from the public eye. This decision was not a whim. It stemmed from deep reasons, both personal and prudent. From a personal standpoint, the Red Book was his most intimate, most sacred garden. Publishing it during his lifetime would have been a form of desecration for him. It was the equivalent of reading his most secret love diary in the public square. This dialogue with his soul was an experience too personal, too raw, too numinous to be thrown as fodder for critical analysis or unhealthy curiosity. But there was also a reason for prudence. Jung was a scientist, a doctor. He fought to make psychology a respected science. He knew that if he published this book, filled with conversations with spirits, visions of gods, and journeys into fantastic worlds, he would destroy his credibility. He would have been called mad, a mystic, a schizophrenic. The world, at the beginning of the 20th century, was absolutely not ready to understand that such an experience could be a healthy exploration of the psyche and not a pathology. He therefore made a strategic choice. He kept the original magma, the raw experience of the Red Book, to himself, and spent the rest of his life translating its discoveries into acceptable scientific and psychological language. All his major concepts, the collective unconscious, archetypes, the shadow, the anima, the self, individuation, were born in the burning crucible of the Red Book. It was only long after his death, after a wait of nearly 50 years, that his heirs, his descendants, finally made the courageous decision to authorize the book's publication in 2009. They understood that the world had changed, that minds might have become more open to the spiritual and experiential dimension of the psyche. The publication of the Red Book was a global event. It allowed for the understanding that the entirety of Jung's work was not an intellectual theory, but the fruit of a lived experience of almost unbearable intensity. It is the beating heart, the hidden source that nourishes all the rest of his thought. But the legacy of this book goes far beyond merely understanding Jung's biography. Its true power lies not in the past, but in the present, in what it means for us today. The Red Book's deepest legacy is that it is a mirror. By reading the account of Jung's journey, we are not just reading his story. We are reading the map of a territory that exists within each of us. The figures he encountered, the shadow, the anima, Philemon, are not his personal ghosts. They are the faces of the universal archetypes that populate our own collective unconscious. Jung's descent is an invitation to recognize that our own inner world is just as vast, just as populated, and just as worthy of being explored. This book holds up a mirror to us and asks, "And you? Where do you stand in your own confrontation with the unconscious? Do you have the courage to speak to your shadow? Do you listen to the voice of your soul? Are you seeking the path to your own self?" Ultimately, the Red Book is not a monument to the glory of Carl Jung. It is a universal invitation to individuation. It is the proof left by a genius explorer that the inner journey is not only possible, but that it is the most important one a human being can undertake. One could see it as the chronicle of a madness. But this is where Jungian psychology's most powerful reframing comes in. What looks like a fracture is actually an opening. The chaos you sometimes feel within you is not a sign of destruction, but the raw material of creation. It is the alchemist's prima materia, the formless mud from which gold can be created. Your sensitivity, your depth, your feeling of being different and overwhelmed are not weaknesses. They are proof that your soul is alive and refuses to settle for a superficial life. It is the sign that you are ready for the greatest of journeys, the one that leads to the discovery of your own self. This book is a call to courage. The courage to turn away from external noise, to listen to the inner whispers. The courage to face one's own demons to find strength within them. The courage to become who we truly are, in our totality, with our light and our darkness. The Red Book is not simply a book about one man's journey. It is a book for the traveler dormant within each of us. It is a door left open with a simple inscription: "Know thyself, and you shall know the universe and the gods." That is where its eternal legacy resides. If this journey into the heart of the Red Book has resonated with you, then you are no longer alone on this path. Affirm your commitment by commenting below with this simple phrase, "I am the explorer of my soul." And subscribe to continue receiving maps for these territories of the soul. If you are thinking of someone who might feel lost in their own inner labyrinth, share this video. Your gesture can be the light that will help them dare to take the first step. For Carl Jung's Red Book is not a dusty relic to be admired in a museum. It is a living invitation, a mirror held up to our own time, which so desperately needs depth. Have the audacity to undertake your own, to write the pages of your own inner Red Book. Stop apologizing for your depth. The world doesn't need another copy. It needs the unique and irreplaceable work of art that you are. Do not extinguish your light simply because it dazzles those who have chosen to keep their eyes closed.